Today's topic is improving sponge functioning at the landscape scale. The presentation will be given jointly by our two speakers. The first one is Dr. Alice Penning, an expert in nature-based solutions from Deltares, the Netherlands. She is project coordinator of SpongeScapes and co-coordinator for SpongeWorks projects. She will present general concepts of sponge function at landscape scale. The second speaker is Benoit Frébourg from the International Office for Water, France. He's in charge of the Sponge Knowledge Platform for the SpongeScapes and SpongeWorks projects. He will share some of his research experience regarding sponge measures. Please, Alice, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much. Am I unmuted now? Yes. So good to see you all, and we're sharing the screen with my presentation. We are going to talk first about some general concepts that are related to sponge functioning. It's a bit of a new term for some of you, perhaps. So let's start with that. What we see at the moment is that if we're talking about water management in general, we are suffering from an increase in floods and in droughts, but also there's a biodiversity decline. And a lot of people are working on these topics, but it's still often very much in a siloed approach where people are looking for measures for droughts or for floods or for biodiversity. And what we're aiming to do is to bring these three together because we're talking about the same water, the same soil, the same part of land that you are wanting to improve. And in order to do that within the SpongeScapes and SpongeWorks project, we are focusing on how can we improve the water cycle within a landscape. And by doing that, we are following a principle or like a motto that says, like, can we do this with green or more nature-based solutions where we can, but also acknowledge that sometimes gray measures are necessary. So talking about weirs, for example, that can help adjust water levels. There's three key principles. If we're talking about how do we retain water in the landscape so that we don't lose it too quickly, so that we can benefit from it during droughts, but also how can we retain that water in the upstream catchment so that it doesn't become flooding problems downstream. And that is to say, okay, let's try to intercept the rainfall where it falls. Rather than draining it very quickly to further downstream, see what you can do to actually be benefiting from that water where it falls. Rain is more and more, especially in the drier season, a commodity that is useful. Of course, during the flood season, you do want to be able to also temporarily store excess water in locations where it doesn't do harm. And then the third one is also to see, can we slow down the runoff and discharge in order to just keep that water in that sponge, in the landscape, right? So that's basically the general principles that we are working from. And we see that these types of thinking of can we do this with green rather than with gray, or before we think about gray, is something that is happening in many European countries already. This is an example from a newsletter that came out in November last year. It's from the UK flood strategy, where they're now actively taking natural flood measures into account. And this natural flood management is part of their overarching strategy. And what we want to do within the SpongeScapes, the SpongeWorks projects, is also to see, okay, we see that we need to store this water, right? And you can do this in the groundwater system. The soil has an important role to play in that, but also the surface water system has an important role in that. And in our current systems, these parts may be damaged. They might be altered by our need to adjust the landscape for a given land use. And what you want to do is to really increase the size of that sponge in order to accommodate that water that we want to retain in it. And there's very many different types of measures that can help that. And Benoit will later on give you some more examples of them, also related to a database that is available that gives you more inspiration on these types of measures. Now, within Europe, there is a big awareness that we need to really work on improving this water management at a landscape scale to make our landscapes more resilient to floods and droughts, or climate resilience, as we may also call this. And therefore, the EU has made a call for two projects, the SpongeScapes and our sister project SpongeBoost, that are really looking into what is the knowledge that is needed to do this, And following up on that, a much larger project that also works on, okay, how do you get this implemented on the ground? And that is the SpongeWorks project. So you see that there is an interaction between how do we bring the necessary knowledge to actually do this in the field. And if you plot all of the different case studies that we are working in these 3 projects, you see that they are scattered throughout Europe. And of course, in different parts of Europe, we have different types of landscapes and different types of slopes, different soils, different climate. So this is not something that is easily to copy, but we can really get inspired by each other. Also, you see there's an 8 with a question mark at the moment. SpongeWorks is also making a selection of 74 applicants that will have to be reduced down to 8 of associate regions. And these associate regions are extra partners that will join these initiatives to also see in other countries what is possible and how can we benefit from this. And we do this with very many partners. This is just a little side show to see that within the SpongeWorks projects, we have 28 partners and they come from practice and from research, but also there's additional knowledge partners that are associated with that. And there's really implementation on the ground going on different types of measures, on large numbers of hectares of land, because this is a big puzzle to make. It's not only one measure that will make a landscape function again. We need to really combine and see how we do this together with different water management authorities, communities, local entrepreneurs and farmers, individual stakeholders, NGOs, etc. That's something that we will want to talk about further also in this webinar and the webinars to come. But let's just first start with watching a little movie that gives you a bit of a flavor of how this all started with the kickoff of the first initiated project. That's the SpongeScapes project. Chloe, can you start the movie?
Got to be realistic though. We're going into a future that we've not really seen, and therefore how these measures perform over time is going to be one of the critical questions we seek to address.
SpongeScapes is an EU Horizon project. In this project, we work with 10 different partners on improving the water retention capacity of landscapes throughout Europe.
And we need to use more natural processes to retain this water so that we can have less problems with big floods or with periods of droughts.
So sponge measures, the idea is to slow the flow, either because you store the flow and you reduce the volume that is carried downstream and affecting infrastructure, people. So the idea of the sponge is also about retaining water and then slowly releasing it when it's more needed.
You see there's an increasing attention to nature-based solutions throughout Europe. And this is also because of this common vision that the EU is really putting forward that says, let's work with nature rather than against it. And there's many solutions to do so. We are using 14 different case studies from southern Greece, southern France to England and Poland, Netherlands, Slovenia and Italy to really get an understanding how sponge measures work in different types of landscapes.
Those case studies provide the reality that is needed in a project like SpongeScapes. It's not just theoretical or modeling, it's grounded in reality.
The idea to develop sponge cities has been around for some years already. However, developing sponge landscapes provide a much stronger lever to really implement transformative change for water retention in Europe and beyond.
We're able to see the change that occurs between the design and implementation of a sponge measure and 28 years, 30 years almost of change, natural change. And over that time, obviously vegetation grows, the river channel might change, and the landscape around it. And so it's vital that we understand how these sponge measures change over time.
We really are looking forward to embrace the SpongeScapes solutions that it will provide, such as the natural-based solutions, to work together interdisciplinary, not only with ecologists, hydrologists, but also with morphologists, geographers, sociologues, in order to boost Europe towards the climate resilience by 2030 and also by 2050.
Therefore, SpongeScapes will take a major step forward in really bringing about change for more resilient landscapes for people and nature.
We've got to be realistic, though.
Okay, that's okay for me. You can go on and share your screen again.
Ik ben hem nu gewoon al gedeeld.
Thank you very much. Let's speak now about a bit of the sponge measures and a bit of history behind that. In the past, the water cycle was seen a relatively simple approach with the ocean bringing through evaporation the water to the land and then back. But the development of the recent knowledge but the development of the knowledge on water cycle showed that it's far more complex. And this complexity is, in particular comes from the green water, which contributes a lot to the land precipitation. This is a scheme presented by INRAE, which conducted recent research on that topic. And that's where green infrastructure, nature-based solution, sponge measures come into place. Green related to green water that contribute to the water cycle. And all this needs further research and investigation to better understand the hydrological cycle in general, but also how it links to the local condition. Let me jump to my next slide. Okay. The water flow in landscapes has been influenced, especially in the 20th century, with some past trends. We have had land consolidation, so we see that the small fields have been concentrated in bigger fields. We have had drainage of the land to allow enter earlier in the season in the fields. We have had more detailed agricultural hydraulics with creation of new weirs, etc., which have also simplified the circulation of water in the land to speed up all this. And we also have had quite some urbanization in most countries in Europe. All this can lead to faster rainfall runoff transfer, which was already addressed to some extent by Elise, and which we need to also consider. And we need to consider that also in the framework of the evolution, the overall evolution that we can also see with climate change in Europe. Of course, we have existing evidence like this one that is presented on the screen about the anomalies on surface air temperature in 2023 as compared to the period 91-2020. But all this creates already issues, but there are also anticipated trends from the climate change. Decrease in precipitation, decrease in the snow, increase in evapotranspiration and in frequency of droughts, but also change in the soil moisture content or change in the flow patterns in the rivers. To accompany that, we have had recent development in water management at EU level, So we have in particular progressive maturation of water-related legislation. The legislator found that, and all the technical engineers that worked on that topic found that there were many holes in between the different pieces of legislation, and there was a progressive shift towards more integrated approach. And also to integrate the recent knowledge, increase of the knowledge on the scientific aspects of ecosystem functioning. We see a growing interest for a range of solutions inspired by nature at EU and international level. The EU developed also some important concepts, the green infrastructure, the natural water retention measures in support of Water Framework Directive implementation. At international and EU level, we also developed the concept of nature-based solutions. And various institutions also develop similar concepts like natural small water retention measures, soil land management, ecosystem-based assessment, sustainable urban drainage systems. If we go back to the origin of those concepts and of the key concepts we are speaking today, the NWM and sponge concepts, the NWM was introduced in the midterm review of the Water Framework Directive, which highlighted that NWM could contribute significantly to negative effects of floods, droughts, and could be also included in the first pile of the CAP for the period 2014-2020. There were associated projects to support its development, the NWM platform that was developed and the network. This pilot project was financed by the DG Environment, so to support the policy development. There was also a community policy document on specifically on NWM and inclusion of the NWM in the CAP annex. And if we come to the sponge, then the sponge is the sponge theory already existed for the wetlands since the 18th century and among the foresters since the 19th century. So it's quite an ancient concept. In the early 2000s, we heard a bit more about sponge cities, which were tested in China and were then extended with this sponge city strategy that China is developing and also communicating on. And in 2022, we have the Horizon program that proposed to boost the sponge function of landscapes so as to improve the climate resilience to water management challenges. The knowledge hub that was developed with this NWM project is continuing to disseminate information about all this knowledge. So there are 140 case studies, there are 53 measures. So we worked a lot on the NWM in the years we did not talk so much about NBS and sponge. So it provides a EU basis. All this was transferred to the WISE nature-based solution for water retention, which will be released in very soon. And it will be updated in the SpongeScapes project and SpongeWorks in the Sponge Knowledge platform that can also appropriate all the new knowledge that will be elaborated in these two projects. Now let's go to the measures themselves. So the sponge or the NWM, it's really similar. It's organized in 4 main categories. The knowledge is organized in that way for an easy retrieval. So it's not strict boundaries, but for easy navigation in the platform and easy identification of the main information. The number of measures is not fixed. It's intended to be scalable, and the measures that are listed have generic names to facilitate the practical implementation and also the financing. So all measures can be usable throughout the territory. Here in this slide, you see 4 examples of individual measures: meadows and pastures, floodplain restoration and management, green roof, land use conversion. Now let's go to some key examples of sponge measures. let's start with the first example on agriculture and hydromorphology, those two categories. So La Lez in France, it's a long and narrow river with 360 square kilometers. There was a recent shift in agriculture with large crop fields, and there are really irregular rainfalls in a hilly landscape. So the development of the project is looking at the river basin scale to implement various types of measures: flood breaking edge rows, leaky dams, edge, agriculture practice, urban measures, etc. So here we see the agriculture hilly landscape and the erosion issue that are existing there, and two types of measures that are already implemented: flood breaking edge rows and buffer strips along the fields. Now let's go to the UK. Again, an example of agriculture and hydromorphology in Littlestock. There's an area in the landscape where there's a narrow river constrained by building, and it has created recurrent flooding, which here is an example of this type of flooding. And there was an approach to zoom out the system to better understand how to tackle the problem. So at river basin scale, but smaller river basin than in the previous example. And here we see some examples of measures that have been implemented. Some types of woodland, some types of retention ponds, leaky dams in the system to allow transfer of the water towards those burns and permanent grass areas where the water is temporarily stored. So these are the type of measures that are implemented and will be investigated further within the SpongeScapes project. Another example, more focused on a very narrow area, so a single measure more, and in the forest sector. So here we see Bosco Limit. It's in Italy, in the Venezia plain, where more than two hectares were converted for 20 years in forests, in an infiltration forest. So the concept is named Forest Infiltration Area, and it covers 1,200 meters waterway and infiltrates already. It was already monitored that it infiltrates 1 million cubic meter per year. So with a multifunction approach, so the multi-benefit of this measure are to protect water and recharge groundwater, but also reduce impact on chemicals, produce biomass, reconstitute fertile soil, so a full bunch of functions. Those functions are really important in the sponge measures. The multi-functionality allow also to address the different challenges that can be found in the areas. Another example on hydromorphology aspect, again, a relatively single measure, that's the use of traditional stone check dams in an area where there are intermittent rivers and drought and unsustainable water use. These traditional check dams prove to have multifunction and recharge groundwater, enhance biodiversity, increase vegetation. And here we see some concrete examples of what it can be. And then to come to my final set of measures, the urban measures that can be used. So the ones that many of you must already know, like green roof, like rain garden, but one can see also infiltration trenches, infiltration paving ways, swales, retention basin. And here the Stockholm trenches, which were implemented in some few years ago, where we see the difference in growing of the trees between an 80 years old tree and a 10 years old tree. So we see also the effectiveness of this type of measures. And then an example on SpongeScapes. In an urban area, we have it's Agripolis and Sant'Orso in Italy, in Padova. It's again the Veneto region from mountain to plains, north of Italy, with pluvial flooding, droughts, landslide, erosion problems. And then the approach at the city and its surrounding with a set of measures from rain garden, bioretention swales, etc., etc. And the final example is it's a much larger case. We have more than 4,000 square kilometers. It's a shared basin between the Netherlands and Germany. It's quite a long river and almost 170 kilometers with an average rainfall of 800 millimeters. And the combined land occupation with a lot of population, 2.3 million people. This is a SpongeWorks example. So SpongeWorks is a project that started more recently. And the key challenges here are surface and groundwater quality and quantity, mitigation of impact, quality of life. And here you see on the map the set of measures that will be implemented and tested on this example. So let me now go to evidences. In the field, you often hear things you don't see in literature. For example, the infiltration rate increased from almost 5 minutes to 23 seconds. The bird diversity increased via this implementation. The implementation of some more soft solution were far less expensive, 17 euro instead of 4 million. But also now some negative trends like in 80-50, there was the water was taking almost 17 days to reach the outlet of the river, whereas now it's just 9 hours. We also heard some good examples of measures where it was the only grazing place left in a very dry summer. In the UK example, we also see following the implementation of the measures, peace of mind or have not been flooded this year, such kind of things. Do they really are evidences? This, of course, needs to be investigated further. In fact, there are substantial scientific evidence supporting the sponge functioning concept. But as we can see from this example, they are to some extent addressing one aspect, but not necessarily all the aspects, like flood, droughts, heat waves. We see here that green approach address flood and heat wave, but maybe less drought. In this example, we also see that afforestation is more efficient for a 2 years flood event, but for less recurrent flood event, more intensive, it may to some extent be less effective. And in the existing database, we also see that despite a wide number of cases, most often they address one or two aspects, but not the entire aspects, flood, droughts, and biodiversity. Within SpongeScapes, we elaborated a critical review of the existing knowledge on sponge function. And we started the elaboration of a set of tables gathering some observed model effects from different events and from different paper documents that allow build the knowledge and elaborate the knowledge. We also identified a set of gaps. Among those gaps, of course, we have sponge measures and often not evaluated for a range of different hydromorphological events and the current and future conditions. So they need to be challenged a bit to the different events. The surface water, groundwater, and soil hydrology, depending on the focus of the exercise, are often analyzed separately. Analysis of the combined effect on hydrological benefit, disbenefit, and trade-offs are often lacking or incomplete. It's not always in focus to really investigate the various disbenefits or the trade-offs or even the benefits. The evidence base for good understanding of the combined effect at landscape scale, because we of course have sponge measures individually, but also at landscape scale with this combination of measures, and there's a need of considering the combined effect at landscape scale, and it's often lacking currently. The role of maintenance is also pretty important over time for the longevity of measures, and it's often hardly known. This is not always very evident how long the measure will length. And the replicability of measures is also in question because it depends also on local context. And this local context is not always correctly reported so that we can compare like with like. And the final point that we identified is integration of quantification of systems understanding with stakeholder engagement on a catchment scale is lacking, whereas stakeholder engagement is really crucial for the catchment scale implementation. And sorry, my last point, the local knowledge, success stories and lessons learned are not so often communicated to the outside world and outside of the local context. Because, well, people implement that as a solution for their local problem, but less often communicate on that and the good results that it can, the inspiring result that it can give also to the participants. Thank you very much. I pass again.
Well, yeah, then we go over to me sharing my screen again.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so it's really interesting to hear, to see also the different examples that we have. Jasper, I cannot yet click through. Can you please? Thank you. And what we see is all these different measures, they all come down to the same three principles that we also talked about at the start of the presentation, is like, how can you intercept this rainfall where it falls? How can we reduce the formation of runoff? How can we slow it down, and how can we temporarily store it? But of course, if you're doing this, it's really important that we really understand the hydrological processes that are behind it. Also, this graph that Benoit showed with the landscape, where you see the different cycles in that, and understanding the social developments of, for example, urbanization and climate change that come up there. So if you're wanting to go forward with this, it's really important to understand those processes and to work at that landscape scale, because an individual measure can only do so much. And for that, we also need to think a bit further, and this is also something that we will work on in the coming webinars, is, okay, how do you then use modeling, and how do you start getting that upskilled understanding, and what is the kind of indicators that is useful to use there? Because especially if we're talking about, for example, okay, if I want to quantify a bit on this, like a flood happens very quickly and it has very different timescales than what a drought is doing. And for urban areas or for agriculture or for natural values, this all works very differently. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a sneak preview on what we will also be going on into the upcoming webinars is, for example, how modeling tools can be used to get that increased understanding. And here we see, perhaps you remember that in 2021, there have been some very heavy floods in the Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Southern Netherlands area. We had 130 millimeters in 2 days. And in this catchment of the Geul, which is one of the rivers in that area, we saw that the downstream city of Valkenburg had experienced extremely heavy floodings. Now, what we've been doing is to see, okay, how does this basin, how does this catchment actually respond to that flood? And we've done some quick calculation assessments to see, okay, in the blue line, which you see, that's the reference line, that's what actually happened. And you see that there's discharges over 100 cubic meters per second in the Valkenburg area. So we did a calculation as the red line. What would have happened if the whole basin was completely paved, right? So that there's no runoff that actually can sink into the groundwater system. And you see it's much larger, that you get peaks that are almost 4 times higher if everything would have been paved. So you see here that actually the soil and the groundwater system have been really able to absorb a lot of that rain. And actually, if we are trying to quantify, it's about 70% of the water actually sank into the groundwater and the system in that event. So that's quite a bit. So the landscape in itself is already functioning as a sponge. Of course, you can say, can we then further reduce this blue line by, for example, doing extra forests? Because forests are also really known to really absorb and reduce and facilitate infiltrating. And there we did some scenarios. And you see that if there's the darkest green line is where the whole catchment would be forested. And you see there's quite some decrease in the peak discharges that you would happen in Valkenburg. But however, in Valkenburg itself, the city has made it into such a bottleneck that only 75 cubic meters per second can actually flow through town. So even with an observed large number of forests, we still not get there. And of course, 100% forest in the catchment is not realistic either, because there's people working there, there's people living there, and there's agriculture being done. But it does give a bit of an idea of like, what are the ranges of the system and what can it supply? And at least it gives you a good start of that dialogue of what can be reached. But it's also important to understand the precondition to such rain events. For example, if it was already a very wet season before it, of course, the soil is more absorbed, or it contains more water, so it can also absorb less water. And if it is dry before an event, a rain event is happening, it can probably absorb more. And sometimes you also hear, if it's super dry, the soil gets hydrophobic and it doesn't really want to absorb water anymore. Understanding this is critical in understanding what measures can do for you and what type of measures and how you're looking for combinations of measures. So for example, the little graph that you see underneath these wet and dry basin schedules, unfortunately, they don't have the same x-axis, y-axis. The one on the wet season shows y-axis up to 400 cubic meters per second, and the other one is 100 cubic meters per second. So you see there's this range again of differences. Now, and this was done for this extreme event, but what also the example that Benoit was giving before on someone saying, oh, this year I wasn't flooded, that was in the UK. These normal events that happen much more often than the super extremes can also be facilitated by reducing the impact of them by using different types of measures in the landscape. And what we want to do is to really see, okay, how do we understand that? How do we monitor? How do we upskill? How do we include knowledge from local stakeholders and how a system is really functioning so that together we can look for the right set of measures within a landscape and work towards really implementing that. Now, this knowledge that we're here going to bring to you in the series of webinars is really there to say, okay, can we bring nuance and realism in this whole dialogue? What are the different events that you've been evaluating for? If you're taking measures for droughts, what's the impact of those measures on the floods? If you're taking out drainage system because that helps for the droughts, what does it do for the floods? Because the drains were put in there for a reason. Same is also about, we can only talk about these primary benefits, but how about the co-benefits for local people? And what are the trade-offs that might be? What's the impact between upstream and downstream? How does a measure upstream influence people downstream? So this combination in overarching strategies is super important, and you really need to understand those well. This is an example from Greece in an apple orchard where they're really looking into combinations of measures to make the harvest in this area also sustainable under extreme or heavy events of both droughts and floods. And this might seem like a very romantic picture, but actually these people are looking over the same area after an extreme hurricane hit the area, Medicane, that's called in Greece. This was Storm Daniel that really flooded about a quarter of the entire basin. And this has really been a big, big issue. So we should also be realistic in saying, okay, what can you do if an extreme event comes by? Is there something you can do? Or do you also have to take other measures into account, such as early warnings and such as zoning? And like, where do you build and do your activities? So basically, we are going to talk also about different types of indicators for sponge measures, not only the technical ones that are related to groundwater level or discharge, but also what people need and what people are experiencing if they are looking for making themselves more resilient in that landscape that they're listening, and telling success stories and lessons learned is very important for that. So basically, this is for us the end of the presentation, but I see there's a lot of questions in the chat. Good for you to know that we are planning this whole set of webinars upcoming. And for now, I'll leave this for the presentation. I give the floor back to our moderators to help us answer the questions.
So yeah, we have several questions in the chat, and Alejandro already answered to some of them, but I think we should go through them, and probably you'll have something to add. For the beginning, Sophie asked if are there any projects in which a karst system is incorporated in the sponge measures?
Perhaps I answer this one. There is a few examples in the SpongeScapes project where karstic systems are part of the overall system. That is the Greek case, which is really complicated because karstic systems have this funny ground geology that really influences like the understanding of how water actually flows between surface water and groundwater. And the same is for Slovenia. So we have a few of these cases, and we do recognize that also there, for example, getting that understanding on landscapes feels quite different than it would be in a sandy soils area, for example, just because the karstic system is also difficult to quantify.
Okay, thank you. So for the next question, we had a question from Tanvi, and the question is, are there any SpongeScape projects in India on flood or drought?
Well, I know Tanvi personally, so I'm very happy that she's here. There are definitely also projects in other areas around the world, and India is part of that. I've heard from other colleagues that are working, for example, a lot in the urban domain. But I think that the idea of having a landscape system understanding, that is really what we need to focus on, and to see, for example, also, okay, what is feasible in a certain location? And does the dynamics of that system, does that facilitate the implementation of these types of measures? And I think that really by really working together between different disciplines, both people that are involved in hydrology, groundwater management, in surface water management, embankment management, but also ecology, agroforestry, urban planning, you can really make this work quite well. Next question.
Okay, so Frederick asked, also Alessandro already answered something, but I think it would be good for everyone to hear if you have something to add. These techniques are interesting for reintegrating nature into our development. Are there links with economists to reintegrate nature into the economy? For example, cost of soil decontamination, evaluation of the role of farmers, more machines to do the work with energy consumption, or also promote manual work?
Benoit, do you want to answer this one?
Sorry, I'm not sure I captured completely the question.
Otherwise, I just give the answer because what I understand is it was a long question. I didn't really see it on the chat myself, but it's super important that you also quantify these other benefits, right? And to say something about what is the impact of these measures for example, agriculture, or what's the impact for like people living in an urban domain. And so there is in the different projects, there is definitely attention for that as well. And also, for example, in SpongeWorks, we are working together with one of our consortium partners, IASA, is really going to do a lot of economic modeling. And also in the SpongeScapes project, we have the people from the University of Padova and 84 that are really focusing on that. Plus also this idea of like how do you get this financed? So that will also be part of that, because there's, of course, like there's different types of ways that you can look at this. It's also talking about what damages do you avoid, for example.
It's also important that to consider that individual measures are always useful, but in general, it's better to integrate a set of measures at a landscape scale so that you can really appropriate, de-zoom the problem to really see if it's a local problem that you want to tackle, but in fact, it's related to the functioning at the landscape scale. So it's also important to have a look at those. And the multifunctionality is also key for those measures because they can. It's also the benefits, the disbenefits, the trade-offs. Everything has to be considered, and that's where the research is also pretty much necessary to also appropriate all those functions, dysfunctions, and understand better how they interact together at a landscape scale.
Yeah, and also just to perhaps add on to that, like this example that Benoit gave of the Vecht, where you see that we're trying to start implementing little pieces of basically the big puzzle on the whole catchment scale. I think that is one of those massive challenges that we face, and that we really realize also that we have to do this together, and that there's different partners, different stakeholders involved, that you need measures in the urban domain, that you need measures related to the agriculture and to the forestry and to the hydrological system and natural areas as well, in order to get to that landscape. And it's going to be quite a lot of work to get it done, because you have to interact with all of these stakeholders.
Okay, so I think we can go to the next question, which is which methods would you recommend to calculate retention, especially for small rivers or ditches?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer like that, because of course, this comes back to this system understanding, right? What is the landscape that you are working in? I think that like for an area in an arid zone in the southern part of Europe, you would think of different measures than that you would think of in terms of if you're going towards a more Nordic area where the climate is very different, where the soils may be very different. So what we try to do with these projects is to give you basically the full flavor and the methods to start selecting what is suitable for you. Where are you? What is useful in terms of for your own stakeholders in the area? Are you working in an area where the slopes are very steep? Are you working in an area where the slopes are basically non-existent, like in the Netherlands where I am from? And we see that, for example, in the Les, they have a lot of problem with soil erosion because their slopes are very steep. So that is really, once you start to understand the system that you are working in, you will find also the set of solutions that's most suitable for you. And within that landscape, you might still have like wetter zones where you might be looking into, can I, for example, remeander a stream? And you have more drier areas where you might say, like, how can I, for example, promote the right type of vegetation for these drier zones rather than having crops or forest there that evaporates a lot. So this is really, and I think that this is what is going to come in the upcoming, and I already encourage you to have a look at this website, the NWRM, where there's already a lot of information, and use it as an inspiration, but always say, do I understand my system? And do I understand how it responds to both flood and drought events and different types of floods, and to see, okay, is this an upstream, downstream impact, for example?
I do think on the retention aspect, there's also different types of metrics depending on what you're looking for. Is it reducing the flat peak? Is it keeping the water on the land? Is it using that for the vegetation? So it's also important to consider all those aspects. And to some extent, as suggested by Alejandro in one of the answers, and the water balance can be a good tool to see where the water goes and evapotranspirate, etc., so that you really find ways to represent that. But it's also to be seen in a dynamic system. As Elise presented, there are some situations where landscape is already fully humid, and then the reaction of the landscape will be different towards the retention than when it's dry. So this dynamic and the temporal aspect is also very important to consider.
Okay, thank you. And are there any studies that show sponge measures are able to directly or indirectly improve crop yield production?
Sorry, what production?
Crop yield.
Yeah, well, this is especially linked to like how do you define that crop yield, right? In terms of like just your overall production, or do you make it more resilient to these extremes? And we see that if you are increasing, for example, your organic carbon in your soils, your land is often much more able to withstand the drier parts of the season. It might not do everything if your drought is like a multi-year drought and there's overuse of water in the entire area, but at least it can help you to just get through that difficult situation a bit easier. And this example where Benoit showed this aerial photograph of like a floodplain that was inundated is one of those examples. That's in the Blenheim estate, where in the UK, they have been re-wetting and reconnecting this floodplain by putting some little leaky dams in the stream itself. And they did this partially also to protect downstream the estate of Blenheim, the castle itself, and also to keep the sediments out of the ponds around that castle. But you also see that because that floodplain got more frequently inundated, it was wetter soils. And when they had those few years of very strong droughts, this was often the floodplain that kept green longer than the other areas. And that was then like one of those last grazing areas for sheep to go, that the farmers put the sheep on that little floodplain there, because that was one of those last fields that was still being green. So you see that there is these types of examples, they are definitely there, yes.
Okay, and how would you ensure the maintenance of nature-based solutions, particularly in disadvantaged areas?
Particularly in disadvantaged areas, yes. Like maintenance with any type of measure is always complicated, right? And maintenance of nature-based solutions is even something that you have to think about during the planning phase, because they develop over time. If you're starting to allow vegetation to regrow again, it might develop onto a very heavy, like for example, floodplain forest, which is good, but also from the biological, the diversity perspective, from the dynamics, but also this, of course, will increase the roughness and thereby may cause like upstream that you're getting more higher flood levels upstream of such an area. So you need to keep it in check. And what you see is that if you start during the planning phase, making arrangements on how you do that maintenance, that is often a way of overcoming potential problems later on. And of course, such floodplains, they will always need to be managed, regardless of whether you do that with a nature-based or with a more traditional way of doing it. So maintenance in your water system, it may change a bit in how you do it, but it's still needed. And that can be both for the more, say, the grayer measures and the greener measures.
And for the greener measure, there's also the fact that those nature-based solutions, they are to some extent, not for all the measures, but to some extent, solutions that are based on the ecosystem. So the ecosystem can sustain itself to some extent, especially in the rivers and around the river in the hydromorphological part. And also in urban areas, most of the techniques that I used are quite common for gardeners. So for the municipality gardeners, it's quite easy to maintain. And a full set of sponge measures are also relatively low-tech measures, where the maintenance can then be done by people who are used to maintain ecosystems in general, be it for natural areas or for more human-influenced areas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And are there any projects where citizen science is incorporated in the sponge measure development and river contracts?
Oh yeah, that's in a lot of them there is citizen science, as we are aware that this is very useful. As we see it especially in the urban domain, that this is really often done, but also with volunteer and nature study groups in the more rural areas as well. And it's really nice that we can see that like this engagement with the local communities through, for example, NGOs that are really focusing on, okay, you know, how is the natural area in our area developing? They can play a big role in that. So, for example, in the Sponge Works project, we are going to monitor water quality together with the landowners. And for that, we're using very simple tools with an app that makes it easy to do that, and their people can easily enter their data points without all the hassle that you might need if you really want to do this in a more like academic way with bringing samples to the lab, etc., and still get quite a reasonable result of that. But you can also think about, for example, initiatives where biodiversity is being monitored by local groups. Last question. We are at the time, it's 12 o'clock as well.
So we have a few more questions. I will go through them, and I would encourage everyone else to later on check our project web pages, or you can send us an email or something, because there is a lot of questions and not a lot of time. So I'll go through the remaining questions shortly. So are there any examples where the soil itself have been improved to function better as a sponges during downpours? For example, mixing the soil with biochar.
Benoit, you want to give a first reply?
For the biochar case, I have no example in mind, but in the SpongeScapes and SpongeWorks project, we have the Greek case that have improved the amount of organic carbon in the soil to a significant extent by covering the soil underneath the olive trees. And they have made some investigations about this improvement, which proved to be really significant, and then to improve the cohesion of the soil and reduce erosion when there are rain events.
Yeah, and of course, there's a lot of examples where, especially for farmers, there's this good promotion of using the cover crops, especially during winter time, to also ensure like a reduced soil erosion, but also that adds to the organic carbon in the soils and all of the good that comes with that. One final question, Tamara. The rest, perhaps we also just say that we answer some via email where necessary.
Okay, we'll answer the remaining ones with email. Also, Alejandro, thank you very much. He already answered to most of the questions shortly. So maybe one more, the last question about the sponge measure concept. So the question is, how does nature-based stormwater solutions relate to the concept of sponge? Are we talking about the thing the same thing in a city context?
Yeah, we're using the word sponge because it is such an easy term. Everyone understands that it will absorb water when there's a lot of it, and that it will also be able to retain that water for a while before it perhaps also slowly drips out of it again. And we also say that the nature-based is part of the set of solutions, but we go for we want to go for them as much as possible, but we also acknowledge that gray measures are part of the set. So the sponge measures, in a way, they also facilitate this dialogue to say like, okay, what is just the most suitable measure in a given location? And if you're working in a landscape that is already heavily modified, it might be a lot more complicated to make like large-scale nature-based solutions happen. And there perhaps some more small-scale technical measures, such as flexible weirs in farmers' areas, in agriculture areas, might be very useful. So from that perspective, I think it's really important to understand that location that you're in.
The border between concepts is also important to set so that we don't not confuse the end users. But the sponge in general is a nature-based solution, or we favor nature-based solution for sponge measures, like in NWM. So the approach is really to use the nature to improve and to restore some key functions of the previous nature to help us tackle the problems with water that we may have.
Okay, thank you all. We've come to the end of our webinar. We don't have any more time, but the webinar will be published on the project's webpage, and all the additional questions that were in the chat will be answered under the published webinar. I would like to invite you once again to join us for our second webinar on 21st of May. I hope you enjoyed it and heard something new and interesting. And thank you for your attention.